Hey everyone, welcome to my channel. If you're inspired by stories of faith, love, and redemption, hit that like button and subscribe. Introduction. Samson tore apart a lion with his bare hands. He single-handedly defeated 1,000 men using nothing but a donkey's jawbone. But what if the greatest danger wasn't in his foes, but in his unchecked impulses? His most difficult battle wasn't with the Philistines, it was with himself. Samson's incredible strength set him apart, but the real test came when he ignored his sacred Nazirite vow and placed his trust in Delilah. In this story, we'll see how even the strongest can fall when self-control is lost. What if someone's life was chosen for something extraordinary before they even took their first breath? A birth unlike any other. Samson's story begins with a moment that stood out, even among the great miracles of the Bible. In a time when the Israelites lived under the harsh rule of the Philistines for 40 years, Judges 13:1, hope seemed distant. It was in this season of oppression that God chose to intervene, and He did so in a way that no one could have predicted, by sending an angel to a woman who had never been able to have children. Manoah's unnamed wife received the angelic promise. On what must have seemed like an ordinary day, she came face to face with a messenger from God. The angel told her the unimaginable. She would conceive and bear a son. In a culture where barrenness was often met with sorrow and shame, this announcement was more than personal joy. It was a message of restoration, not just for her, but for her entire nation. Like Hannah and Sarah before her, this barren woman carried a promise of deliverance. The angel's instructions were clear and specific. This child was not to be raised like any other. As part of his vow, Samson would abstain from wine, avoid anything unclean, and never cut his hair. Signs of his lifelong dedication. The Nazirite vow was usually a temporary commitment, but in Samson's case, it was to last his entire life. It was not a choice he would make for himself, it was chosen for him before he was even born. When Manoah's wife relayed the angel's instructions, they both recognized this child was set apart from conception. Even before Samson took his first breath, the path of his life was marked by a calling that demanded obedience and faithfulness. His mother was told to follow the same restrictions during her pregnancy, highlighting how the process of setting Samson apart began even in the womb. Every detail mattered. Samson's birth carried the weight of expectation. He was not just his parents' long-awaited child, he was Israel's hope in a time of darkness. The Israelites needed more than a judge. They longed for a deliverer who could break the Philistines' grip. From the start, Samson was called to a purpose greater than himself. Imagine what it must have felt like to grow up knowing that your life was meant to fulfill a promise made by God Himself. But with such a calling came a challenge. Samson's story is filled with a unique tension. His beginnings were miraculous, his purpose clear, but his journey would not be simple. The story hints at this from the very start. Being chosen for something great does not guarantee that the path will be easy or that the outcome will be perfect. Samson's life would unfold as a series of struggles between his divine calling and his human desires. It's important to notice how the symbols of Samson's vow shaped his identity. His uncut hair was not just a family tradition or a mark of individuality. For a Nazirite, every strand was a visible sign of dedication, a reminder to the community and to Samson himself that his strength and purpose came from God. He did not get to choose this symbol, it was given to him as part of his calling. For his parents, following these instructions was an act of faith, trusting that God's plan was at work even when it was hard to understand. The expectations placed on Samson were immense. He was set apart not just by his parents' faith, but by a public sign that everyone could see. People would recognize him as different, as someone whose life was tied to a higher purpose. The Nazirite vow was more than a list of rules. It was a declaration that Samson belonged to God in a special way. With every year that passed, his uncut hair became an even more powerful symbol of that commitment. Yet, as we look ahead in Samson's story, we see how difficult it is to live up to such a calling. The paradox is striking. The very things that made his birth extraordinary would become the source of his greatest struggles. Being set apart brought both honor and pressure. Samson's choices, his character, and even his mistakes would carry consequences that went far beyond his own life. The angel's message to Manoah's wife was not just about a miraculous birth. It was a call to obedience, to trust, and to set her son apart for a purpose only God could see fully. The story reminds us that God often uses the most unlikely people and the most unexpected circumstances to bring about his plans. Samson's life began with hope and promise, but it also carried a warning. Potential alone does not guarantee success. Samson's hair, the outward sign of his vow, was a constant reminder of his relationship with God. It wasn't magical in itself, but it represented the bond between Samson and the one who gave him strength. As long as he honored that commitment, he remained connected to the source of his power. But the meaning of a symbol depends on the heart behind it. If Samson lost sight of what his hair stood for, he risked losing much more than his appearance. He risked breaking the trust that set him apart in the first place. As we reflect on Samson's beginnings, it's easy to focus on the miraculous details: the angel's visit, the promise given to a barren woman, the strict vow that shaped his life. But the story is also about the choices that come after such a beginning. What matters most is not just how a story starts, but how it continues when faced with real challenges. Samson's miraculous birth points to the incredible potential God placed in his life. It shows us that being chosen is both a gift and a responsibility. As his story unfolds, we'll see how the outward symbols of faith, like his uncut hair, can only hold their meaning when matched by a heart of obedience. This brings us to a deeper question. How could something as ordinary as hair hold such extraordinary power in Samson's life? The sacred symbol of strength. How could something as ordinary as hair hold such incredible power? For Samson, it wasn't his hair alone that gave him strength, it was what it represented. To understand why Samson's uncut hair mattered so much, we need to look at the unique vow he was under. This wasn't a promise he made later in life. It was something that defined him before he was even born. Samson was a Nazirite, set apart by God for a very specific purpose. Now, the Nazirite vow is described in the Old Testament in Numbers 6, 1-5, and it's nothing short of remarkable. Imagine making a life decision with such visible and demanding commitments. At its heart, the Nazirite vow was about total dedication to God. Those who took it chose, or as in Samson's case, were chosen, to live differently. They abstained from wine or anything fermented, avoided any association with the dead, and, crucially, never cut their hair. While others could freely enjoy aspects of daily life, someone under this vow openly declared, "I'm set apart for God's purposes." Samson's hair, growing long over the years, was far more than a style choice or a family tradition. It was the ultimate symbol of his calling. In his case, it wasn't just a personal, private commitment, but a declaration to everyone who saw him. His long hair told a clear story. He belonged to God. It highlighted his unique identity, setting him apart even in the way he appeared. More than that, it served as a reminder, to him and to others, that his strength wasn't his own. Samson didn't wake up one day and decide to perform superhuman feats. Those moments were empowered by God, and his uncut hair symbolized that divine connection. But why uncut hair, of all things? The prohibition against cutting hair in the Nazirite vow symbolized something sacred. Hair grows continuously without the involvement of scissors or blades. In a way, it served as a visible reminder of uninterrupted devotion to God. Every time Samson ran his hands through his hair or felt its weight down his back, it told him and everyone around him that his life wasn't ordinary. He had been marked for something extraordinary. When we think of Samson's strength, it's tempting to focus solely on his physical feats, but the deeper truth lies in his spiritual connection. Samson's might wasn't simply in the length of his hair, it was in what his obedience to the Nazirite vow represented. That's why cutting it wasn't just a physical act, it was a symbolic break in his relationship with God. Number 6 makes it clear that a Nazirite's vow wasn't about personal pride or achievement. It was an act of humility and dependence, recognizing that all strength comes from God. Breaking that vow, then, was more than just disobedience. It meant stepping away from the source of what made them set apart. But Samson didn't walk through life as a quiet, introspective figure, quietly meditating on the meaning of his vow. His life was loud, bold, and often impulsive. He remained visibly different, yet despite that outward distinction, his actions started to show a different story. His long hair stayed intact, but his choices didn't always align with someone who was holy and set apart. This dynamic makes the story of Samson all the more compelling and, honestly, tragic. His hair grew as his strength grew, and for years he lived the life of a hero in the eyes of many. He was admired, feared, and revered. When people looked at him, they saw a man with the blessing of God, a man with an invincible power. Yet the strength people associated with Samson's imposing physique was never rooted in his own abilities. That's what makes his story so layered. Samson's hair wasn't magical. Instead, it reflected something bigger. It was outward evidence of inward obedience, and when that obedience faltered, everything else would begin to unravel. Consider this. The Nazirite vow was never just about restrictions for the sake of restrictions. The rules around uncut hair, avoiding wine, and staying away from the dead served a purpose. They weren't random, but designed to emphasize reliance on God over self. Even the act of saying no to seemingly harmless things, like wine or grooming routines, was a daily reminder of where their trust should lie. For Samson, his hair represented decades of that trust. As long as it remained uncut, there was a sense that his life was aligned with God's calling, even if his choices didn't always reflect the same alignment. In many ways, Samson's uncut hair stood as a public statement of holiness and obedience, both to Israel and to their enemies. Every Philistine who crossed paths with him could see that he was different, and with every feat of strength, the connection became undeniable. His victories weren't just his own, they were a display of the God backing him. Think about the battles he fought, the lives he saved, and the victories he won. None of these were possible on human strength alone. His hair, visible, unhidden, served as a loud and undeniable proclamation. His success came from God. But this whole framework of obedience raises critical questions about individuality and responsibility. Samson wasn't passive in this story. His long hair couldn't save him from himself. The Nazirite vow, powerful as it was, depended on more than just observing restrictions. It also required the person living under it to respect and honor its meaning. Samson knew what his hair symbolized, but was that enough to keep him grounded? His story warns us of something deeper. Physical signs of devotion only carry meaning when paired with actual faithfulness. A statue of strength can be hollow if the foundation beneath it crumbles. What happens then when that symbol cracks? We know from Samson's story that cutting his hair would lead to disaster, but not because there was anything inherently magical about it. Rather, it was the visible sign of his relationship with God, and breaking that promise destroyed a sacred connection. When Samson's hair was eventually cut under heartbreaking circumstances, it wasn't as if God's power disappeared from him on a technicality. It signified that Samson had stepped away from the trust and dependence that gave him his power in the first place. It's a sobering reminder of how Samson's greatest strength was also tied to his greatest vulnerability. He held extraordinary power, but it was given to him for a higher purpose. And just as strongly as his uncut hair stood for connection and trust, it also carried a risk. To break the vow was to sever the lifeline to his strength. This wasn't something that could be ignored or brushed aside. Numbers 6 made that clear when it laid out the expectations for Nazirites. The standards were high because the calling was high. But here's the thing. Samson's vow and his hair was always a symbol, not an ultimate source of power. His strength didn't come from his hair any more than the sun rises because of the color of the sky. The hair was a reminder, a tether to the God providing the strength. And while Samson's hair grew long over time, his struggles with choices and impulsive actions revealed an inconsistency in understanding where his strength truly resided. So we're left asking an important question. If Samson's strength wasn't truly wrapped up in his hair, why did losing it have such devastating effects? The answer comes down to obedience. The long hair didn't create the power, God gave it. But the hair reminded everyone of the relationship between Samson and God. Cutting it meant that relationship had been breached. It wasn't just an outward change, it reflected a deeper spiritual break. Samson's story should prompt us to reflect on that tension. Symbols of faith are powerful, yes. They serve as reminders of greater truths, but the real strength doesn't lie in the symbols themselves. Samson lost his power not because some magical energy drained out when the scissors cut his hair, but because his disobedience cost him his connection to the one who gave him power in the first place. By the time his hair was cut, we're reminded that outward appearances can only reflect what's happening internally. And if that inner faithfulness is neglected, even the strongest symbols will falter. So what happens when symbols like strength and obedience are tested by dangerous choices? Samson's next steps take us to battles beyond anything he faced with lions or Philistines. Let's see how his choices shaped the rest of his story. Strength unleashed, a lion and a jawbone. Strength unleashed, a lion and a jawbone. Samson's story is marked by moments when his strength became a force that no one could ignore. These acts weren't just about physical power, they revealed something deeper about his relationship with God and the purpose he was meant to serve. The first time this strength was revealed, it happened in a way that was both sudden and unforgettable. On his way to Timnath, Samson was met by a young lion. The animal came at him with all the speed and danger you'd expect from a predator. In that moment, Scripture says, the Spirit of the Lord came mightily upon him, and Samson tore the lion apart with his bare hands. There were no weapons, no time to prepare, just Samson and the lion. This was not a feat of human ability alone. The Bible makes it clear that God's Spirit was the source of his power, not Samson's own effort. The act was a sign, both to Samson and to those who would later hear the story, that God could work through him in extraordinary ways. What stands out is that Samson didn't tell anyone about the lion, not his parents, not the people he was visiting. He continued on as though nothing unusual had happened. This detail shows a pattern that would repeat throughout his life, moments of great strength kept private or used for personal reasons rather than shared as signs of God's deliverance. Later, the lion's carcass became part of a riddle that Samson used to challenge the Philistines at his wedding, showing how even his greatest feats could become tangled with his personal motives. Samson's strength was not limited to wild animals. Perhaps the most well-known story is when the Philistines tried to capture him. They sent 1,000 men to bring him in, thinking they could finally put an end to his resistance. The odds were overwhelming, 1 man against 1,000, And Samson had no weapon, but he picked up the jawbone of a donkey, something no one would expect to use in a fight. With that simple tool, he struck down 1,000 Philistines. This moment is important because it shows that the source of Samson's strength was never about the weapon he held. The jawbone, like the lion, was a reminder that God could use anything, or anyone, to accomplish his purpose. The victory was dramatic, and it sent a message to both the Israelites and their enemies that God's power could not be limited by numbers or by conventional means. The jawbone became a symbol of how God works through the unexpected. After the battle, Samson named the place Ramath-Lehi, which means Jawbone Hill. It's interesting that he chose to mark the site with a name that focused on the tool he used, rather than on God's deliverance. This detail hints at a struggle within Samson, a tendency to see his victories as personal achievements rather than as acts of God's deliverance for his people. In each of these stories, we see a pattern. Samson's strength is real and undeniable, but the way he uses it often points back to himself. When he killed the lion, he kept it to himself and later used it for a personal challenge. When he defeated the Philistines, he named the place after his weapon. Even after these acts, his first response was not always gratitude or worship. After the victory with the jawbone, Samson cried out to God, not in thanks, but in frustration about his thirst, asking if God would let him die after such a victory. This moment shows us that even someone with great gifts can struggle to see where those gifts come from and what they are meant for. The Spirit of the Lord played a central role in these events. Whenever Samson's strength was unleashed, it was because God's Spirit came upon him. This was not a power Samson could call up whenever he wanted. It was given for specific moments, for a purpose that was bigger than his own desires. The Spirit's presence was a sign of God's favor and a reminder that Samson's calling was to begin delivering Israel from the oppression of the Philistines. Yet, even with this divine empowerment, Samson's choices were often shaped by his own impulses. He was quick to act, sometimes without thinking about the consequences. His strength allowed him to win battles, but it also led him into situations that could have been avoided. The story of the lion and the jawbone shows how God's power can work through a person, but it also warns us about the dangers of using that power without wisdom or self-control. Samson's actions were dramatic and public, but his victories were often solitary. He did not gather others to join him or lead the Israelites in a united effort against their oppressors. Instead, he acted alone, driven by immediate challenges or personal motivations. This isolation set him apart from other leaders in Israel's history, who often worked with others to achieve God's purposes. The impact of Samson's strength was felt by everyone who witnessed or heard about his feats. For the Israelites, it was a sign that God had not forgotten them, even after years under Philistine rule. For the Philistines, it was a warning that their power was not absolute. But for Samson, these moments were part of a larger struggle, a tension between the calling God had placed on his life and the desires that pulled him in other directions. As the stories of the lion and the jawbone show, strength can be both a blessing and a challenge. Samson's power set him apart, but it also isolated him. His victories were real, but they often came at a cost. The more he relied on his own impulses, the more complicated his life became. His actions began to create cycles of conflict and retaliation rather than lasting peace. The story does not stop with these displays of strength. Each victory brought new challenges and new temptations. Samson's tendency to act alone, to use his strength for personal reasons, and to overlook the greater purpose behind his calling set the stage for even greater conflicts. As his story unfolds, we see how quickly a moment of triumph can turn into a source of trouble. These stories invite us to reflect on our own lives. We may not face lions or armies, but we all have gifts and opportunities. The way we use them matters, not just for ourselves, but for those around us. Samson's life encourages us to remember our purpose and to seek wisdom as we act. As we move forward in Samson's story, we see how quickly things can change. What begins as a show of strength can become the start of conflict and misunderstanding. Sometimes, the smallest actions, like a riddle at a wedding, can have consequences no one expects. The riddle that sparked a war. How could a simple riddle turn into the spark that ignited a war? For Samson, what began as a clever challenge at his wedding feast quickly unraveled into betrayal, anger, and bloodshed. It's a story that reveals much more than conflict. It exposes the flaws in Samson's character and the dangers of unchecked strength. It all started with a riddle. After killing the lion on his way to Timnath and later discovering honey in its carcass, Samson decided to turn this strange experience into a test of wits. At his wedding feast with the Philistines, he posed this challenge to the 30 men who were present. Out of the eater came something to eat, and out of the strong came something sweet. The riddle wasn't just a tease, it was personal. Samson knew that no one else could possibly solve it because it was based on his private encounter with the lion and the honey. He was testing their cleverness, but he was also asserting his superiority. To make it interesting, Samson offered a high-stakes wager. If they solved it within 7 days, he would owe each of them a set of fine clothes. If they couldn't, then the 30 men would owe him the same. At first, the Philistine guests had no answer. The riddle was too obscure for them to figure out, and as the days passed, their frustration mounted. It wasn't just about the riddle anymore, it was about pride. Losing to Samson, an outsider, would have been an embarrassment too large to accept. So they turned to manipulation. Rather than admit defeat, the Philistines approached Samson's new bride and demanded that she help them solve it. But they didn't simply ask for her cooperation. They threatened her, saying, "Entice your husband, or we will burn you and your father's household with fire." Their demand wasn't a polite request, it was laced with cruelty and fear. Samson's wife found herself in an impossible situation. On one side was her husband, a man of terrifying strength, and on the other side was her people, who had made it clear that disobedience would mean destruction for her family. The pressure they placed on her was immense, and the emotional strain soon turned into action. She began to beg Samson for the answer. Day after day, during what was supposed to be a joyful celebration, she wept before him, pleading, "You hate me. You don't really love me," she insisted, using guilt and tears to get what she needed. For Samson, this was more than emotional manipulation. It was betrayal taking root in his own household. Finally, after days of relentless pressure, Samson gave in and shared the answer with her. What stands out here is how quickly trust fell apart. The challenge of the riddle wasn't just meant for the Philistines, it was also a test of loyalty. Yet, under the weight of threats and fear, his wife revealed his secret to the Philistines, and just like that, the answer was theirs. On the 7th day, they approached Samson with the smug certainty of victory, posing the answer in the form of a question. What is sweeter than honey? And what is stronger than a lion? Samson immediately knew what had happened. Their sudden knowledge wasn't a clever deduction, it was stolen from him through betrayal. Angry and humiliated, his response was sharp and cutting. "If you had not plowed with my heifer, you would not have solved my riddle." His words stung with resentment, a clear accusation that his wife had been used against him. But Samson wasn't the type to let things end there. In a fit of rage, Samson left the feast and descended into violence. To settle the bet, he traveled to another Philistine town, Ashkelon, where he killed 30 men, taking their clothing to pay off the wager. It was a brutal act, driven not by duty or divine instruction, but by sheer anger. Wearing the clothes of the men he had slaughtered, Samson returned to fulfill his promise, but the damage to his marriage and his reputation had already been done. His impulsive reaction escalated a conflict that was brewing beneath the surface, and the cycle of retaliation took root. This story reveals a significant pattern in Samson's life. His strength allowed him to act without much thought to the consequences. Killing 30 Philistines might have solved the riddle's wager, but it created something far more dangerous. Revenge wasn't just an impulsive reaction. It became a cycle that eroded trust, escalated violence, and ensured ongoing tension between him and the Philistines. What's striking is how often Samson's responses came out of frustration or anger rather than a calculated sense of purpose. His strength became a double-edged sword, unstoppable and destructive, even when his motivations were petty or rooted in personal offense. What can we learn from this? Samson's impulsiveness wasn't simply about his temper. It was tied to how he viewed his strength. He didn't stop to question whether his power should be used for something greater than settling personal disputes. His strength gave him the ability to act decisively, but he rarely paused to consider the bigger picture. In offering the riddle, Samson wasn't trying to teach or inspire. He was showing off, enjoying the feeling of outsmarting others. But when that cleverness backfired, his immediate solution was violence. The riddle itself wasn't the problem, it was Samson's approach to it, the pride and carelessness that influenced its creation and escalated its consequences. By using his private experience as a weapon to embarrass his Philistine guests, he set himself up for conflict, and by reacting to betrayal with fury, he ensured that peace would remain out of reach. His actions, though undeniably impressive, show us the dangers of strength when it's not guided by wisdom or self-control. This event also highlights something deeper about Samson's relationship with those around him. His wife's betrayal wasn't just about fear. It also pointed to a lack of connection between her and Samson from the beginning. Their relationship, based more on appearances and circumstances than loyalty or trust, couldn't withstand the pressure from the Philistines. Samson's strength may have been unmatched, but his ability to foster trust and unity was weak. The tension between personal strength and relational weakness became a running theme in his life. It's worth noting that this moment marked a significant shift in Samson's story. What began as a personal challenge at a wedding feast turned into years of conflict, bloodshed, and vengeance. The Philistines weren't just defeated, they were humiliated by Samson's actions. But humiliating an enemy isn't the same thing as delivering your people. Instead of securing peace for Israel, Samson's impulsive actions inflamed tensions, ensuring that the cycle of violence would continue. The riddle didn't just spark his conflict with the Philistines, it laid the foundation for a war that could have been avoided. Samson's reliance on vengeance would come up again and again, each time pulling him further away from his calling to deliver Israel. His strength, instead of being a tool for peace, became a battering ram for anger and frustration. What's striking is how consistent this pattern is throughout his life. Over and over, Samson used his power not to fulfill God's plan, but to satisfy his own emotions. And each time, the consequences reminded him, and us, that strength without wisdom leads to chaos. This story leaves us with an important question. How far would Samson go to see his revenge through? If an unsolved riddle and a moment of betrayal could lead to this level of violence, what would happen when even deeper insecurities and power struggles came to the surface? As conflict continued to simmer between Samson and the Philistines, his choices became increasingly dramatic and destructive. What started with a wager at a wedding would snowball into acts of revenge that shaped not just Samson's life, but the lives of everyone around him. With every step Samson took, his strength set him apart, but his impulsiveness set him on a path toward greater conflict. If his goal was to deliver peace to Israel, his actions seemed to take him further from it. And this raises another question. When the pursuit of revenge consumes someone, where does it end? For Samson, his strength became both his weapon and his weakness, propelling him forward into storms he could have avoided. What began with a riddle would become a dangerous cycle that would test not just his power, but his purpose. So, How far would Samson go to seek revenge? As we'll see, his anger burned hotter than the flames of the destruction it caused next. Let's step into the next chapter of Samson's story and witness how his choices set entire fields ablaze. Revenge and the burning fields. Samson's story shifted once more from personal insult to public destruction with the burning of the Philistines' fields. In the wake of his failed marriage, Samson faced not just disappointment, but a deep sense of betrayal and humiliation. After the riddle and the violence at his wedding, his wife was given to another man, one of his companions. For Samson, this was more than a social slight. It was a blow to his honor and pride. His reaction was not measured or restrained. Instead, he chose a path that would leave a mark on the entire region. To strike back, Samson devised a plan that was as creative as it was destructive. He went out and caught 300 foxes, or possibly jackals, as some scholars suggest, since jackals often moved in packs, making them easier to trap. The number alone is staggering, showing not only his determination but also his resourcefulness. Once he had the animals, he tied them together in pairs by their tails, fastened a torch between each pair, and set the torches alight. Then he let them loose in the Philistines' standing grain. The result was chaos. The terrified animals, bound together and panicked by the flames, darted through the fields, spreading fire in every direction. The flames quickly consumed not just the standing grain, but also the harvested sheaves, the vineyards, and the olive groves. What started as a personal vendetta became a disaster for the entire Philistine community. Their food supply, their economy, and their sense of security went up in smoke. It's hard to picture the confusion and despair as people watched their harvest disappear in a matter of hours. This wasn't just an act of destruction, it was a deliberate attack on the Philistine way of life. The crops, the olives, and the grapes were the foundation of their food and their wealth. By destroying them, Samson struck at the heart of their power. The loss was more than physical. It threatened their future, their trade, and their ability to maintain control over the Israelites. It was a move that showed how one person's anger, when combined with strength and ingenuity, could shake an entire nation. But Samson's motivation was deeply personal. He wasn't acting as a judge or a deliverer for Israel at this moment. He was acting out of hurt and anger over what had happened to him. The burning fields were not about justice for his people, they were about revenge for his own pain. This distinction matters because it shows how quickly a calling can be overshadowed by personal emotions. Instead of using his strength to lead or protect, Samson used it to lash out. The Philistines quickly learned who was responsible for the destruction. Samson's reputation had already made him a figure to be feared, and this act only confirmed his willingness to go to extremes. The people wanted someone to blame, and they soon discovered the reason behind Samson's rage. His wife had been given to another man. Their response was swift and brutal. In retaliation, they took Samson's wife and her father and burned them to death. This moment is especially tragic. The woman, who had been caught between two worlds, her own people and her new husband, became a victim of the violence surrounding her. She had betrayed Samson under pressure, hoping to protect herself and her family, but in the end, she paid the ultimate price. The Philistines' act of revenge mirrored Samson's own, a life for a life, fire for fire. The cycle of violence deepened, and with each turn, the consequences became more severe. Samson's reaction to this new loss was immediate and fierce. He declared that he would not rest until he had taken revenge for what they had done. He attacked the Philistines again, striking down many of them. The Bible doesn't record the exact number, but the focus is not on the count, it's on the growing intensity of the conflict. Each act of violence led to another, and the hope for peace seemed to slip further away. What stands out in this part of Samson's story is how his strength, meant for deliverance, became a tool for personal vengeance. His calling as a Nazirite had set him apart for a purpose, But his choices often reflected his own impulses rather than God's plan. The destruction of the fields was a powerful blow to the Philistines, but it did not bring about freedom or lasting change for Israel. Instead, it invited more retaliation, more pain, and more loss. The economic impact of Samson's actions cannot be overstated. The Philistines depended on their harvest for survival. Grain, oil, and wine were not just luxuries, they were essential for daily life and for trade. By burning the fields, Samson threatened to cause shortages and hardship, not just for the rulers, but for ordinary families. The loss of crops could mean hunger, financial ruin, and increased tension between the Philistines and the Israelites. This act of arson was a strategic blow, but it was also a reminder of how quickly personal anger can spill over into the lives of many. The Philistines quickly learned who was responsible for the destruction. Samson's reputation had already made him a figure to be feared, and this act only confirmed his willingness to go to extremes. The people wanted someone to blame, and they soon discovered the reason behind Samson's rage. His wife had been given to another man. Their response was swift and brutal. In retaliation, they took Samson's wife and her father and burned them to death. This moment is especially tragic. The woman who had been caught between two worlds, her own people and her new husband, became a victim of the violence surrounding her. She had betrayed Samson under pressure, hoping to protect herself and her family, but in the end, she paid the ultimate price. The Philistines' act of revenge mirrored Samson's own, a life for a life, fire for fire. The cycle of violence deepened, and with each turn, the consequences became more severe. Samson's reaction to this new loss was immediate and fierce. He declared that he would not rest until he had taken revenge for what they had done. He attacked the Philistines again, striking down many of them. The Bible doesn't record the exact number, but the focus is not on the count, it's on the growing intensity of the conflict. Each act of violence led to another, and the hope for peace seemed to slip further away. What stands out in this part of Samson's story is how his strength, meant for deliverance, became a tool for personal vengeance. His calling as a Nazirite had set him apart for a purpose, but his choices often reflected his own impulses rather than God's plan. The destruction of the fields was a powerful blow to the Philistines, but it did not bring about freedom or lasting change for Israel. Instead, it invited more retaliation, more pain, and more loss. The economic impact of Samson's actions cannot be overstated. The Philistines depended on their harvest for survival. Grain, oil, and wine were not just luxuries, they were essential for daily life and for trade. By burning the fields, Samson threatened to cause shortages and hardship, not just for the rulers, but for ordinary families. The loss of crops could mean hunger, financial ruin, and increased tension between the Philistines and the Israelites. This act of arson was a strategic blow, but it was also a reminder of how quickly personal anger can spill over into the lives of many. Delilah's deception. Delilah's part in Samson's story is one of the most sobering examples of how trust can be misused and how persistent manipulation can bring even the strongest person to their knees. The Philistines had tried everything to capture Samson, but nothing had worked. His strength was legendary, and every attempt to overpower him had ended in failure. So the Philistine rulers decided to use a different tactic. They would go after his heart. They approached Delilah, the woman Samson loved, and offered her a fortune, 1,100 pieces of silver from each ruler if she could uncover the secret of his strength. The sum was enormous, enough to tempt almost anyone. Delilah agreed, and what followed was not a single act of betrayal but a drawn-out campaign of emotional pressure and calculated questioning. She began by asking Samson directly, "Tell me the secret of your great strength and how you can be tied up and subdued." Samson, perhaps sensing the danger or simply wanting to maintain some control, didn't give her the truth. Instead, he played along, giving her false answers. First, he claimed that if he were bound with 7 fresh bowstrings, he would become as weak as any other man. Delilah wasted no time in testing this, and when the Philistines rushed in, Samson easily broke free. Delilah's persistence did not waver. She tried again, and this time Samson told her that new ropes would do the trick. Once more, Delilah set the trap, and once more Samson broke free without effort. Frustration must have been growing on both sides. Delilah's questioning became more intense, her words more pointed. She accused Samson of making a fool of her and not truly loving her. Each time he resisted, she pressed harder, mixing pleas for honesty with challenges to his affection. Her tactics were not just about asking questions. They were about wearing him down emotionally, making him feel guilty for keeping secrets from someone he loved. Samson, for all his outward strength, struggled with this kind of pressure. He could fight off armies and wild animals, but when it came to the slow, steady drain of Delilah's questions and accusations, he began to falter. Over and over she pressed him, day after day, until his spirit was worn out. Her persistence was relentless, and it became clear that she would not stop until she got what she wanted. The Bible says that Samson was vexed to death by her constant nagging. Finally, Samson reached his breaking point. He told her the truth. "No razor has ever come upon my head, for I have been a Nazirite to God from my mother's womb. If my head were shaved, my strength would leave me, and I would become as weak as any other man." In that moment, Samson revealed not just the secret of his strength, but the core of his identity. His hair was not magical, but it was the outward sign of his special vow to God, a symbol of his dedication and the source of his strength. Delilah knew immediately that this time Samson had told her everything. She sent word to the Philistine rulers, who returned with the promised silver. As Samson slept on her lap, Delilah called in someone to shave off the 7 locks of his hair. With each cut, the symbol of Samson's vow and his connection to God was stripped away. When it was done, Delilah began to torment him, knowing that the strength he once had was gone. Samson woke to Delilah's cry, "The Philistines are upon you, Samson!" He thought he would rise as he always had before, ready to shake off his attackers, but this time was different. The strength he had relied on was gone, and he did not realize that the Lord had left him. The Philistines seized him easily, binding him in bronze shackles. They gouged out his eyes, taking not only his freedom, but also his sight. They led him to Gaza, where he was put to work grinding grain in the prison, a task meant for animals, a public display of his humiliation. This moment in Samson's story is filled with loss. He lost his strength, his freedom, his dignity, and even his vision. The Philistines, who had feared him for so long, now paraded him as a trophy, celebrating what they believed was the triumph of their gods over the God of Israel. Samson, who had once been unstoppable, was now reduced to a symbol of defeat. Delilah's actions reveal much about the power of persistence and the dangers of misplaced trust. She did not overpower Samson with force, but with words and emotional pressure. Her persistence, fueled by greed, wore down his resistance until he finally gave in. This part of Samson's story shows that even the strongest can be brought low when trust is given to someone who does not deserve it. Delilah's manipulation was effective because it played on Samson's desire for love and acceptance, using his feelings against him. Samson's downfall was not just the result of Delilah's actions, it was also the result of his own choices. Throughout his life, Samson struggled with self-control. He often acted on impulse, letting his desires guide his actions rather than his commitment to God. His willingness to trust Delilah, even after seeing her try to betray him several times, shows how easily he let his guard down. He valued his relationship with her more than the vow he had made to God, and in doing so, he lost the very thing that made him unique. The consequences of this betrayal were severe. Samson's capture was a public spectacle. The Philistines celebrated his defeat, giving credit to their own gods and mocking the God of Israel. For the Israelites, seeing their strongest leader blinded and enslaved must have been a crushing blow. Samson's story became a warning about the dangers of pride, impulsiveness, and misplaced trust. Yet, even in this dark moment, there is a small sign of hope. The Bible notes that Samson's hair began to grow again after it had been shaved. This detail hints that the story is not yet over. Samson's strength was never just about his hair, it was about his relationship with God. The return of his hair suggests the possibility of restoration, a reminder that even after great failure, there can still be a path to redemption. Delilah's deception stands as a powerful lesson. It shows how greed and manipulation can destroy trust and lead to devastating consequences. It also reminds us that true strength is not just about what we can do on our own, but about who we trust and what we value most. Samson's downfall was the result of many small choices, each one moving him further from his calling and closer to disaster. As we consider Samson's story, it's important to reflect on the nature of strength and weakness. Physical power can accomplish great things, but without wisdom, self-control, and faithfulness, it can be lost in an instant. Samson's experience with Delilah is a reminder that the greatest battles are often fought within, and that the choices we make about trust and loyalty can shape the course of our lives. Samson's journey did not end with his capture. The pain and humiliation he faced in prison set the stage for what would come next. His story, marked by both triumph and failure, invites us to think about what happens when a hero loses everything. Can someone who has fallen so far ever find a way back? The fall of a hero. Samson's fall was as public as his strength had once been. The man who had once inspired awe now stood as a warning, his story echoing through the streets of Gaza and beyond. The Philistines had not just captured him, they had stripped him of everything that once set him apart. His strength was gone, his vision lost, and his freedom replaced by the weight of bronze chains. What had once been a life marked by promise and power now became one of humiliation and routine. After Delilah revealed his secret, the Philistines wasted no time. They seized Samson, and their first act was to blind him. In the ancient world, blinding a captive was more than punishment. It was a way to erase a person's influence and dignity. For Samson, whose very name meant "like the sun," the loss of sight was a sharp and painful reversal. He had once been a light for his people, and now he moved in darkness, both physically and spiritually. The Philistines wanted everyone to see that their enemy had been defeated in every way. They dragged him back to Gaza, the very city where he had once carried away the city gates as a sign of his strength and God's deliverance. Now, those same gates closed behind him. Shackled in bronze, Samson was forced to grind grain in prison, a job so lowly it was often given to animals. The daily grind was monotonous and degrading, a far cry from the battles and victories that had defined his life. Each turn of the millstone was a reminder of how far he had fallen. The Philistines made Samson a public spectacle, parading him as their prize. For years he had been their greatest enemy, the one who had embarrassed and defeated them. Now he was a symbol of their power and a warning to anyone who might challenge them. Their celebrations were loud and confident, and they gave credit to their god Dagon for Samson's defeat. To them, his fall was proof that their gods had triumphed over the God of Israel. Samson's experience in prison was not just about physical suffering. It was a time of silence and reflection. As he ground grain day after day, he had time to remember the choices that brought him there. His strength had always been a gift, but he had often used it for his own purposes rather than God's. He had trusted the wrong people, acted on impulse, and ignored the responsibilities that came with his calling. The darkness around him was matched by the darkness within, a sense of regret, loneliness, and loss. The fall of a hero. Samson's fall was as public as his strength had once been. The man who had once inspired awe now stood as a warning, his story echoing through the streets of Gaza and beyond. The Philistines had not just captured him, they had stripped him of everything that once set him apart. His strength was gone, his vision lost, and his freedom replaced by the weight of bronze chains. What had once been a life marked by promise and power now became one of humiliation and routine. After Delilah revealed his secret, the Philistines wasted no time. They seized Samson, and their first act was to blind him. In the ancient world, blinding a captive was more than punishment. It was a way to erase a person's influence and dignity. For Samson, whose very name meant like the sun, the loss of sight was a sharp and painful reversal. He had once been a light for his people, and now he moved in darkness, both physically and spiritually. The Philistines wanted everyone to see that their enemy had been defeated in every way. They dragged him back to Gaza, the very city where he had once carried away the city gates as a sign of his strength and God's deliverance. Now, those same gates closed behind him. Shackled in bronze, Samson was forced to grind grain in prison, a job so lowly it was often given to animals. The daily grind was monotonous and degrading, a far cry from the battles and victories that had defined his life. Each turn of the millstone was a reminder of how far he had fallen. The Philistines made Samson a public spectacle, parading him as their prize. For years he had been their greatest enemy, the one who had embarrassed and defeated them. Now he was a symbol of their power and a warning to anyone who might challenge them. Their celebrations were loud and confident, and they gave credit to their god Dagon for Samson's defeat. To them, his fall was proof that their gods had triumphed over the God of Israel. Samson's experience in prison was not just about physical suffering. It was a time of silence and reflection. As he ground grain day after day, he had time to remember the choices that brought him there. His strength had always been a gift, but he had often used it for his own purposes rather than God's. He had trusted the wrong people, acted on impulse, and ignored the responsibilities that came with his calling. The darkness around him was matched by the darkness within, a sense of regret, loneliness, and loss. In that place of humiliation, something unexpected was taking shape. Samson's suffering was real, but it was not wasted. The grinding of grain and the jeers of the crowd became the backdrop for a quiet transformation. He had lost everything, his strength, his freedom, his sight, but in the darkness he found humility. He began to depend on God in a way he never had before. Samson's story is a reminder that even in our lowest moments, hope can still be found. The consequences of his choices were painful, and his suffering was real, but God's presence had not left him. The regrowth of his hair pointed to a deeper change, a heart turning back to the one who had called him from birth. Sometimes it takes losing everything for us to see what really matters. The public display of Samson's defeat was meant to be a warning, but it also became the setting for something greater. The Philistines believed they had won, that their God was stronger and their power secure. But they could not see what was happening beneath the surface. They did not know that the God of Israel still had plans for Samson, even in his weakness. As we look at this part of Samson's story, it's easy to focus on the loss and humiliation. But there is also a quiet strength in his willingness to endure, to keep going, even when everything seemed lost. His story is not just about physical power, but about the journey from pride to humility, from self-reliance to trust in God. Samson's fall teaches us about the weight of our choices and the reality of consequences. It shows how quickly strength and success can be lost when we forget their true source, but it also reminds us that no one is beyond hope. Even when we feel defeated, God can work in ways we do not expect. In the temple of Dagon, surrounded by his enemies, Samson stood as a shadow of his former self, yet in that place, the seeds of faith and dependence were growing. The final chapter of his life was about to unfold, not through another display of personal strength, but through a renewed trust in God. The stage was set for a moment that would reveal where true strength comes from. What happened next would not only change Samson's story, but would also challenge us to think about where we place our trust and how we respond when everything seems lost. A final act of faith. In the crowded temple of Dagon, Samson faced the final test of his life. Surrounded by thousands of Philistines who had gathered to celebrate their victory, he stood, blind and humbled, his strength gone and his reputation shattered. The laughter and jeers of his enemies filled the air, and the memory of his past failures must have weighed heavily on his heart. Yet, in this moment, something in Samson changed. He no longer relied on his own power or cleverness. Instead, he turned to God with a simple, honest prayer, a final act of faith. Samson's prayer was not long or complicated. He said, "Sovereign Lord, remember me. Please, God, strengthen me just once more." For a man who had spent much of his life acting on impulse and pride, these words marked a turning point. He did not ask for strength to restore his own glory. He did not bargain or make promises. He simply asked God to remember him and to give him the strength he needed for one last moment. In this prayer, we see humility, dependence, and a recognition that true strength comes from God alone. The scene in the temple was chaotic. The Philistine rulers and thousands of people crowded into the massive building, eager to mock their old enemy. Samson was brought out as entertainment, a living symbol of their triumph. The leaders, emboldened by what they thought was the defeat of Israel's God, gave credit to Dagon, their own idol. The noise, the celebration, and the sense of victory were overwhelming. But in the midst of this, Samson quietly asked the servant leading him to place his hands on the two main pillars of the temple. It seemed like a harmless request. No one imagined that this blind, broken man could pose any threat. As Samson stood between the pillars, his hair had begun to grow again, a small but important sign that God's presence was not gone. The Nazirite vow, broken in the past, was now being honored in a new way. This time, Samson's heart was turned toward God, not toward himself. His final prayer was not about revenge alone. He wanted to avenge the loss of his eyes, yes, but he also wanted to fulfill the purpose God had given him from birth, to begin delivering Israel from the Philistines. God heard Samson's prayer. In that instant, strength returned to him, not the kind that comes from muscles or training, but the kind that only God can give. Samson braced himself, placing one hand on each pillar. With a deep breath, he pushed with all his might. The pillars began to tremble. The stone above shifted. The entire structure shook as the weight of the temple pressed down. The roof collapsed, crushing everyone inside, including the rulers and the thousands gathered on the roof. Samson's final act was both powerful and costly. He died along with the Philistines, sacrificing his own life to strike a decisive blow against Israel's enemies. Judges chapter 16 verse 30 tells us that Samson killed more people in his death than he had during his entire life. This act was not just about personal vengeance, it was a fulfillment of his calling, a deliverance that came at the highest price. The temple of Dagon, once a symbol of Philistine power, lay in ruins. The leaders who had mocked God were gone. The people who had celebrated Samson's downfall now faced the consequences of their pride. There is a bittersweet quality to Samson's ending. On one hand, his final act is a moment of redemption. After a lifetime of mistakes and missed opportunities, he turned to God in faith and obedience. He recognized that his strength was never truly his own. In his weakest moment, he trusted God to work through him, and God answered. This act of faith restored Samson's purpose and allowed him to fulfill the role he was given before he was born. On the other hand, Samson's story is also tragic. His life could have been so much more. He was set apart for greatness, chosen to lead and deliver his people. Yet much of his story was marked by impulsive decisions, broken vows, and personal struggles. His greatest victory came only after he had lost everything: his freedom, his sight, and his pride. The cost was high. and the pain was real. Samson's death was a victory, but it was also a reminder of what might have been if he had lived his whole life with the faith he showed at the end. Still, Samson's story offers hope. God did not abandon him, even after all his failures. When Samson called out in faith, God responded. The grace shown in this moment is a powerful reminder that no one is beyond redemption. Even when we make mistakes, even when we stray from our calling, God can still use us for his purposes. Samson's final act teaches us that it is never too late to turn back to God and to trust him for the strength we need. The destruction of the temple was more than just a military victory. It was a statement about who truly holds power. The Philistines believed their god Dagon had defeated Samson and the God of Israel, but in the end, it was the Lord who prevailed. By answering Samson's prayer and bringing down the temple, God showed that he is sovereign over all nations and all idols. The Philistines' celebration turned to disaster, and their confidence in Dagon was shattered. God's deliverance came in an unexpected way, through the humility and faith of a man who had lost everything. Samson's family came to collect his body and buried him between Zorah and Eshtaol in the tomb of his father Manoah. His story closed with a sense of completion, but also with lingering questions. What could have happened if Samson had lived with this kind of faith all along? How much more could he have accomplished if he had trusted God from the beginning? These questions invite us to reflect on our own lives and the ways we use the gifts and opportunities God gives us. As we read about Samson's final act, we are reminded that true strength is not about what we can do on our own. It is about recognizing our dependence on God and trusting Him, even when we feel weak or unworthy. Samson's life was far from perfect, but his last prayer was sincere. In that moment, he became an example of faith in action, a reminder that God can work through anyone who turns to Him. Samson's story does not give us easy answers. It is a story of highs and lows, of great promise and painful failure. But it also shows us the power of faith, even in the darkest moments. When Samson prayed for strength, he was not asking for a second chance to live as he once had. He was asking for one last opportunity to fulfill his purpose. God honored that prayer, and through it, delivered His people. As we think about Samson's journey, we see that redemption is possible, even after great loss. God's grace can reach us wherever we are, no matter how far we have fallen. The final act of Samson's life reminds us that it is never too late to turn to God and trust Him with our story. Let's take a moment to reflect on what Samson's story means for us. His life raises important questions about strength, faith, and obedience. It invites us to look beyond outward success and to consider where true strength comes from. Samson's journey encourages us to rely on God, to seek His purpose, and to remember that even in our weakest moments, God's power can bring hope and deliverance. The meaning of Samson's story. When we look closely at Samson's life, we see that his story is more than a record of mighty deeds or dramatic failures. The meaning of Samson's story goes beyond his physical strength or the spectacle of his final act. What stands out most is the tension between what he was called to be and how he actually lived. Samson's journey invites us to think about the difference between outward power and inner character, and what it truly means to live by faith. Samson's life began with promise. Before he was born, God set him apart as a Nazirite, a person dedicated to God's service in a special way. This vow wasn't just about rules or rituals, it was about living with a purpose that pointed back to God. Samson's uncut hair, his abstaining from certain foods and drinks, and his avoidance of things considered unclean were all outward signs of this calling. But as his story unfolds, we see that keeping a vow outwardly is not the same as living it out inwardly. Samson's strength was a gift, but his choices often revealed a struggle to honor the spirit of his calling. Throughout his life, Samson's actions were shaped by his impulses and desires. He often acted before thinking, letting his emotions lead him into trouble. His relationships with Philistine women, especially Delilah, show how easily he was distracted from his mission. These choices brought pain not only to himself, but to those around him. The cycle of revenge, betrayal, and conflict that followed Samson was rooted in his inability to control his own heart. Even his greatest victories, like defeating 1,000 Philistines with a donkey's jawbone or tearing down the gates of Gaza, were often sparked by personal anger rather than a desire to serve God's people. Yet, Samson's story is not just a warning about the dangers of unchecked impulses. It's also a story about God's patience and faithfulness. No matter how many times Samson failed, God did not abandon him. Even after Samson broke his vow and lost everything, God was still able to use him. This does not mean that Samson's choices didn't matter. They had real consequences, for himself and for others. But it does show us that God's purposes are bigger than our mistakes. In the end, God worked through Samson's final act of faith to deliver his people from their enemies. One of the most important moments in Samson's story comes at the very end. When he is at his weakest, blinded and imprisoned, Samson prays, "Sovereign Lord, remember me. Please God, strengthen me just once more." This prayer is simple and honest. It's not about showing off or seeking revenge for the sake of pride. It's a moment of dependence, a recognition that strength comes from God, not from ourselves. For the first time, Samson's heart is fully turned toward God, and this is what makes his final act so meaningful. The Bible doesn't hide Samson's flaws. He is not presented as a perfect hero, but as a person with real struggles. His lack of self-control and his tendency to act on impulse are clear throughout the story. These weaknesses led him away from his calling and into moments of deep regret. But the Bible also shows us that faith is not about perfection. In Hebrews chapter 11, Samson is listed among the heroes of faith, not because he lived a flawless life, but because he turned to God when it mattered most. His inclusion in this hall of faith is a powerful reminder that God values faith even when it comes from broken places. Samson's life teaches us that true strength is not found in what we can do on our own. It's found in our willingness to trust God, especially when we feel weak or uncertain. Physical power, talent, or success may impress others, but they cannot replace a heart that seeks God. Samson's story invites us to think about where we place our trust. Are we relying on our own abilities, or are we willing to admit our need for God's help? The answer shapes not only our actions, but the kind of people we become. Another lesson from Samson's story is the importance of self-control and obedience. His downfall was not caused by a lack of opportunity or talent, but by a lack of discipline. He had every advantage, a unique calling, supernatural strength, and clear signs of God's presence in his life. Yet without self-control, these gifts became sources of trouble. Samson's story reminds us that discipline and obedience are not restrictions meant to hold us back. They are boundaries that help us become who God created us to be. When we ignore them, we risk losing sight of our purpose. Samson's journey also highlights the value of community and accountability. Much of his life was spent alone, fighting battles by himself. He rarely sought advice or support from others who shared his faith. This isolation made it easier for him to make reckless choices and harder for him to stay focused on his mission. Today, we can learn from this by seeking out relationships that encourage us to grow in faith and character. Walking with others, sharing our struggles, and learning from Scripture together can help us stay connected to God's purpose for our lives. It's also important to see that Samson's failures did not disqualify him from being used by God. Even after losing his strength, his sight, and his freedom, Samson's story was not over. His final prayer and act of faith show that redemption is always possible. God can bring hope and purpose out of our darkest moments. This does not mean that consequences disappear, but it does mean that our story can have a new direction when we turn back to God. Samson's life encourages us not to give up even when we feel we have gone too far. Samson's place in Hebrews 11 is a reminder that faith is not about having a perfect record. It's about turning to God, sometimes again and again, and trusting Him to work through us. Samson's last act was not about reclaiming his old strength, but about fulfilling the purpose God had given him from the beginning. In that moment, he became a deliverer, not because of his own power, but because of his faith in God. So what can we take from Samson's story? It's a call to examine our own lives. Are we living by impulse, or are we seeking God's guidance? Do we try to handle everything on our own, or do we invite God into our struggles? Samson's story shows us that God can use anyone, no matter how many times they have failed, if they are willing to trust Him. His life is a reminder that our greatest moments come when we recognize our need for God and ask Him for strength. Samson's journey also challenges us to rethink what it means to be strong. The world often tells us that strength is about control, independence, or outward success, but Samson's life points us in a different direction. True strength is about humility, obedience, and a willingness to depend on God. It's about letting go of pride and opening our hearts to the one who gives us purpose. As we reflect on the meaning of Samson's story, we see that it is not just about the past, it's a living message for anyone who wants to grow in faith. Samson's life is both a warning and a source of hope. It warns us about the cost of unchecked impulses and the pain of living without discipline. But it also offers hope that, no matter where we are or what we have done, God's grace is still available. Let's take this story with us as we think about our own journey. Samson's life encourages us to choose faith over pride, to seek God's help in our weakness, and to remember that even in failure, there is a way forward. His story reminds us that what matters most is not how strong we appear, but how willing we are to trust God with our lives. By understanding the meaning behind Samson's story, we can begin to see strength in a new light. It's not about what we can do on our own, but about what God can do through us when we turn to Him. This lesson prepares us to think more deeply about how faith, obedience, and trust shape the way we live each day. Conclusion. As we reach the end of Samson's story, we see that true strength is measured by faithfulness and our relationship with God. Samson's life reminds us that impressive outward abilities mean little without a heart turned toward God. His victories came when he depended on the Spirit of the Lord, not on his own power.